This story centers around a small town which was always busy and crowded. There was a very popular small dumpling restaurant in town. Pao was a regular customer of this restaurant. One day he invited two of his friends to go with him. The restaurant opened at 4 p.m. and closed just merely 2 hours later, so those who wanted to taste the food had to go early. The owner of the restaurant was a middle-aged man. As he recently made some changes to his recipes, the food had been selling like hotcakes. It looked like there was only one table available at the restaurant. Pao and his two other friends sipped their tea while waiting for their food to be served. 15 minutes later, the dumplings were finished. Pao and his friends were delighted as soon as they knew the food was ready to be served. The steamy dumplings arrived in a wooden container. The appetizing aroma made Pao and his friends drool. They quickly grabbed chopsticks and picked up the dumplings one by one, hungrily ate them whilst not forgetting to dunk the cakes into the red sauce. As part of the white dumpling was covered with sauce, Pao stuffed it in his mouth and chewed on it with a joyful expression on his face. After tasting the dumplings, one of Pao's friends expressed his utter amazement. He didn't expect the cakes to be so tasty. As the guys were enjoying their dishes, one of them suddenly chewed something very hard. Thinking his friend had accidentally chewed a grain that was left in the dumpling, Pao quickly reassured his friend not to be bothered about it. But what was worth mentioning here was that the guy in the blue shirt removed something from his mouth, and it was definitely not a grain. His face changed color as he gazed at the thing he'd just taken out from his mouth. His limbs started to tremble. He stammered, "Human nail!" How could there be a human nail inside one of the dumplings? The nail was covered in a substance that looked extremely dirty. Pao was shocked and outraged. He was furious to think that these dumplings were made in filthy conditions. The unexpected appearance of human nails inside the dumplings didn't just happen to Pao and his friends. As the nearby tables also encountered the same situation, they started calling out the restaurant owner. Pao slammed his hand on the table. He pointed at the owner and howled loudly. Seeing the outrage in his customers, the restaurant owner acted surprisingly as if he had no idea about the serious incident. He was even more surprised when Pao shoved the nail to his face. Normally he was the only one in charge of making these fillings, and there was no one else but him doing this job. But the infuriated customers wouldn't patiently listen to his explanations. As the man was still unable to speak, Pao quickly grabbed him by the collar and threw a powerful punch to the man, making both his nose and mouth bleed. The restaurant owner was badly beaten up. Moreover, he was also taken to the police station by Pao and his friends. It was already late and there were only 3 officers on duty. One sheriff named Liu Feng, together 2 of his colleagues, officers Ping and Chao. As they were about to go to the canteen, they heard noises outside. Sensing something bad had happened, the sheriff got out of his seat and went to check. No sooner had he arrived at the door than he saw Chao rushing towards him. "Sir, there are many civilians outside the gate. They want to sue the restaurant owner for leaving nails in the food." The sheriff's face changed color as soon as the situation was reported. With his acute thinking, he quickly figured out this was not a simple case. In less than 15 minutes, the sheriff, together with Chao and Ping, had taken the restaurant owner to the interrogation room. The sheriff gave a brief report on the case to the restaurant owner. It was out of the question for someone to pull out their nails and put them inside the dumplings, so the only convincing explanation for the incident was the fillings of the cakes had been made of human flesh. The restaurant owner was in tremendous shock as he listened to the officer. He seemingly had no idea about it, and he was not the one behind all of this. The sheriff ordered his 2 colleagues to go to the restaurant and examine the dumplings there. At that moment, many people had been reported on the incident. They quickly gathered in front of the restaurant. Many of them were scared to find out about the news. For a long time, the people in this town had eaten the dishes served at this restaurant. So was it true that they had eaten human flesh? However, some of them refused to believe the rumors, as they wanted to go to the scene in person and hear the final conclusion from the cops. Ping and Chow had already been in the kitchen of the restaurant as they started looking for evidence. A few seconds later, large bags of meat that was used to make the dumpling fillings had been found. As the two officers opened one of the bags, they were amazed to see what was inside them. The meat had been minced, so they weren't sure whether this was actually human meat or not. Hence, these bags of meat needed to be taken away and carefully examined. The officers reassured the civilians, then took one of the bags back to the station for further examination. After interrogating the restaurant owner, the police had found out about the place where he got the meat for his dumpling fillings. They quickly sent out vehicles to the destination. Inside the house was a muscular man slaughtering a pig with his butcher knife. The man acted bizarrely as soon as he saw the cops. He asked them in an annoying manner, "Why are you people here in my house?" Chow remained calm to the man's ferocious face as he got straight to the point, asking if the man was the meat supplier for the dumpling restaurant in town. As the butcher finally knew what the officer was referring to, he showed no fear. With a serious look on his eyes and a cold voice, the man confirmed he was the one, and asked what the officers wanted from him. Ping asked him what the exact type of meat he gave to the restaurant owner, and how could there be human nails in the dumplings. As soon as Ping finished his sentence, the butcher pulled out the knife from the cutting board and spoke with a cold face. "It's not your business to know what kind of meat it is. Why do I have to answer your question anyway? Get out of here, now!" As the two officers were still unable to react to the butcher's aggression, the man suddenly rushed to them like a madman, brandishing his knife at them. Chow showed no fear as he faced the psycho. He pushed Ping to the side while dealing with a man with a sharp knife on his own. Ping dodged the blade from the madman and came at him after switching from defense to his attack mode. He quickly blocked the man's knife holding hand, then used all his strength to wrestle the man to the ground. His heavy body fell into the table, making it break in half. The man felt his body aching and could barely move. Moments later, the other cops had arrived to take the guy to the police station. The case had been rapidly resolved, but Chow still had a thought on his mind that the man had been keeping human bodies in his house. The cops started to survey the scene. As the butcher was taken away, he turned his head and howled that those people deserved to be killed. The officer ordered the rest of the team to quickly find the bodies. The priority now was to find where he kept his victims. The vehicle that carried the butcher made his way back to the police station. The officers who were still at the scene searched the place, but it was more difficult than they thought, as an hour had passed, yet they still found nothing relating to the man's victims. At the moment when the officers were about to leave, suddenly from behind an old lady ran to them. It looked like she wanted to say something. It turned out that she was one of the butcher's neighbors. For years she had encountered with so many bizarre things, but she didn't have the nerve to tell anyone as she was scared she could be the next victim of the serial killer. When the man was first moving to the neighborhood, he seemed like a good man to her, as if she often saw him helping poor people, giving them shelter and feeding them. But the odd thing was that the beggars, they went into his house and somehow they were never seen again. Moreover, the old lady also added that she also usually heard people sobbing and screaming at night. One night, she plucked up her courage to pull aside the window curtains, only to witness something truly horrifying. There were lots of white shadows appearing in her view. The longer she gazed at them, the more abnormal these people seemed to her. She couldn't make out their faces no matter how hard she tried. On several occasions, she wanted to report the incident to the police, but the fear of being his next victim had prevented her from doing it. But since the man had been arrested, she believed it was the right time to tell the truth. Despite it not their first time dealing with brutal murders, the officers present shivered as they listened to the old lady. Officer Chow quickly ordered the other officers to get shovels and hoes as they headed to the spot where the lady had told them. They believed there was an underground cellar where the man kept the bodies. Nearly 30 minutes later, one of the officers spoke loudly. "There's something very hard here. Come take a look." As Chow had expected, there was a secret cellar in the butcher's house. Before their eyes was an iron lid with handles on the surface. Ping plucked up his courage and then carefully grabbed the handle and removed the cover. A stench came out as soon as the officer lifted it. People at the scene had to cover their noses, their faces became darkened. Indeed, there was a secret cellar with stairs leading to it. The foul smell together with the pitch darkness inside the place didn't discourage Ping as he courageously walked down the stairs. He shone the flashlight into the dark. His face immediately changed color. What had caused him to be that terrified? Now he was no longer brave enough to keep going, his body frozen. Aside from cutting boards and the knives, there were also things that were truly shocking and beyond one's imagination. Dead bodies hung on the walls, and underneath them were baskets filled with human organs. The case had been cleared. The famous restaurant in town had used human flesh to make its products, and the butcher, it was certain that he would pay for the deadly sins he had committed. This story is about a man named Kim. As most of his childhood had been pampered by his parents, the man was very lazy. As time went by, it was until his mother became old and no longer had physical ability to work. Together with the scolding of his older siblings, the man decided to go out looking for a job. But Kim had no idea where he was heading to. He didn't even know what job would be suitable for him either. Luckily, he encountered a construction site on the way and assumed there would be a job for him. As Kim walked in the place, he met a worker with a cigarette in his mouth, looking bossy. Kim asked the man if he knew any job that was cushy enough for him to take. The man suggested him taking the job he was doing. He told Kim that he just needed to stay at the construction site, guarding it for a time period of 6 months. Kim agreed to take the job, and today was also his first day at work. After he was given the job, he followed the man to take a look around the site, then went to his row houses to stay. It was old row houses. Seemed like they had been built a long time ago, but strangely as he arrived there, he saw nobody. There were just utter silence and pitch black darkness. But Kim didn't care much about it. As for him, having an easy job like this had already been an achievement to him, so the man didn't ask for anything else. After a long day of working, he felt exhausted, and it was weary to think of going out finding something to eat, so he chose to order food online. 15 minutes later, the food was delivered to him. Life being away from mom was amazing, the man thought to himself. He could sleep throughout the day, and with a phone that had access to Wi-Fi, he could order any kind of food he wanted to. After he finished his meal, he didn't even bother to clean up the mess as he left it there, and went outside to check the construction site. 20 minutes later, Kim returned to his shelter and went to bed. The man had fallen asleep as soon as he closed his eyes. But when it came to midnight, Kim suddenly had a feeling of heaviness all over his body. Even though he changed his sleeping position multiple times, he still found it uncomfortable to go back to sleep. He also felt cold and his body was drenched with sweat. At first, Kim tried to close his eyes tightly so he could get back to sleep, but failed to do it as he felt like there was someone behind him, while there was rustling to be heard. Feeling unable to put up with the bizarreness going on, Kim got up. He looked around, yet found no one in the room but him. Observing for a while, suddenly he stopped his gaze at the table. He didn't know why he did it, but he had a bad premonition. He tried to assure himself that there was nothing odd happening. It was just his imagination, and then went back to sleep. The next morning, Kim woke up to tiredness as he didn't have a good sleep the night before. He got out of bed with his eyes barely open. But as Kim walked past the table next to his bed, he suddenly widened his eyes, mouth agape in amazement. Looked like he had seen something surprising. Turned out that what he saw was the empty food containers on the table. If he recalled correctly, they were leftovers from last night, but somehow they all disappeared. The chicken pieces and the bowl of soup had been eaten. The doors had been locked before he went to sleep, so there wouldn't be any chance that cats or dogs could break into the room, even the smaller ones. Kim was really curious about the mysterious disappearance of the leftovers, and for that reason he intended to bring more food with him and leave some leftovers for the night, as he wanted to find out who had eaten the food that night. This time he brought more food to the room, and only ate sparingly. The man was under the impression these leftovers would lure the ones who dared to steal his food that night. Kim intended to stay up all night to catch the culprits, but he was soundly asleep before the clock struck midnight. But just like the previous night, as soon as the clock said 12 o'clock, Kim once again had a feeling of heaviness all over his body, as if there was someone laying on him, which made him feel uncomfortable. The rustling together with the old gusts of wind awoke him. He again had a bad premonition, but this time he didn't quickly sit up. Instead, he slightly opened his eyes and turned his gaze onto the table. Kim took a deep breath to reassure himself, then slowly opened his eyes. His face suddenly changed color. Now it wasn't just the amazement he expressed when he found out about the incident this morning, but it was a terrifying expression on his face. There were flickering white shadows gathering around the table where he placed his food. Ghosts were standing around the table, picking up food with their bare hands and devouring it. The ghosts looked like they had been left starving for years. The white shadows with lifeless eyes had easily freaked out anyone. Despite panicking, Kim still came up with a way to chase the ghosts away, as he reached out to the switch and turned the lights on. Indeed, the ghosts disappeared as soon as he turned the lights on. Kim couldn't believe his eyes, or what he had just seen. To confirm what he'd been thinking was true, he plucked up his courage and walked to the table. Indeed, the food had disappeared. There were just empty plates left on it. Without a doubt, it was the ghosts that had eaten the leftovers, but this affirmation made Kim really scared. The man had a habit of leaving leftovers since he was a young kid, but this was his first time dealing with such a thing. Kim couldn't understand why this horrifying incident had happened to him. Was it him, or was this place haunted with voracious ghosts? But to reassure himself, Kim tried to come up with another answer for the problem he was dealing with, as he assumed he might have had hallucinations. Kim got back to his bed, tightly closed his eyes and waited for the sun to rise. The next morning, to clear his mind, Kim set out to town and went to a market. The noisy atmosphere at the market would help him forget about the fears he had last night. As Kim was walking around, he saw some fortune tellers. Recalling the incident last night, he approached them. A fortune teller looked at him and said, "Are there ghosts in your house? You look very anxious." Surprised by how quickly the man could find out about his problem, Kim told him everything about the bizarre incident and asked for his help. The man's face became darkened as he listened to the story. According to him, the construction site was once a mass grave, and most of them were left abandoned. The apartment building was built right on the mass grave. As a result, this place was often seen with starving ghosts at night, but they didn't harm anyone. However, Kim still asked the man to help him as he was scared. The fortune teller gave him a talisman, saying it would keep the ghosts away as long as it was placed at the front of the door. He even told Kim not to leave leftovers. Having received the talisman, Kim gave the man some money, then quickly left. With the talisman in his hand, Kim was bewildered, not knowing what to do. Even though he was scared of the ghosts, part of him still wanted to help them since they were pitiful and harmless to people. It took Kim a while to finally make a decision on whether to hang the talisman at the front of the door or not. If he did it, the ghost wouldn't be able to enter his room, but he didn't have the will to do it. Being hesitant for a while, Kim decided to throw the talisman away, as he believed the ghosts would never try to harm him. Since that day, somehow he was no longer bothered by the ghosts. Actually, he had placed a table outside the room and put some of his food onto it. The food was there for the pitiful ghosts to eat. From being a man with lazy, uncaring attitude, Kim had turned over a new leaf and became a better person. This story I heard from my old friend Kaleem. The story may sound a bit ridiculous, but he firmly asserts that the story was true. At that time, Kaleem was unemployed and was thinking of opening a small restaurant. That day, while Kaleem was taking a walk, he suddenly discovered a small alley with glimmering yellow lights. Kaleem decided to go inside to take a look and discover a small restaurant. It looked old and had only one sign in front. Curious, Kaleem went inside to check it out. Different from the old appearance, the inside was extremely busy. Many people were also eating here. So Kaleem came to the table and ordered a few dishes. They seemed to be the signature dish of the restaurant. Among them was the sweet and sour young ribs of the restaurant. Just taking the first bite, Kaleem was extremely surprised by the special taste of ribs. Tender ribs melt in his mouth, sweet and sour spices were tasty. After eating and drinking, Kaleem thought that the bill would be high because these dishes were delicious and plentiful, and Kaleem also ordered quite a few. But when the owner brought the bill, he was surprised because the price was very cheap. So, from then on, Kaleem used to come to this restaurant every day. Kaleem also noticed whenever he went to the restaurant, Kaleem saw many regular customers like him. Only strangely, they looked very similar. Everyone was fat. Perhaps only Kaleem was the slimmest in the restaurant, because he often came to eat. The restaurant's owner also greeted him. The owner of the restaurant was also chubby. That day, Kaleem also came up and ordered the restaurant's signature ribs. It seemed that Kaleem also gradually became addicted to this dish without knowing it. The owner's wife also greeted Kaleem and asked if the meal was good or not. In his mind at that time, Kaleem also began to have ideas for his restaurant. Kaleem suddenly told the owner's wife that this dish was so delicious it would be a waste to sell it in this cramped alley. So Kaleem wanted to buy the dish's recipe. He also made it clear to the owner that he just bought it under the form of a franchise, not intending to appropriate this recipe. The owner's wife immediately expressed displeasure. She said that the whole family, young and old, relied on this restaurant. If the recipe was spread like that, it would no longer be exclusive and the number of customers would no longer be the only one here, which would affect the restaurant's revenue. As soon as he heard that, Kaleem immediately stood up, holding his stomach with one hand, showing a painful expression, and told the restaurant's owner's wife that his stomach was suddenly very painful. He asked her to pack the leftovers on the table to take home. Because Kaleem knew that this restaurant only sold food at the restaurant, not takeaway, Kaleem could only say that he had a severe stomach ache. Seeing that, the owner's wife did not say anything, hurriedly went to find a box to pack for Kaleem to bring home. As soon as she turned away, Kaleem revealed a proud smile because he had accomplished his plan. A few minutes later, the owner's wife also packed all the food for Kaleem and even wished him a good meal. Kaleem also acted as normal, as if he had a stomach ache, not like he was pretending. But as soon as he left the restaurant, Kaleem immediately took out his phone and called an acquaintance. That person was a friend of Kaleem and was working in the food industry, so he was very experienced. It turned out that Kaleem wanted to ask that friend to help him taste the dish to find out what the ingredients for the sweet and sour ribs were and would use the recipe for Kaleem's restaurant. Although Kaleem's friend was an experienced person in the culinary industry, after tasting it, he was also very thoughtful because the ingredients were not too difficult, but the type of meat to make it, he couldn't know. After that, Kaleem's friend began to try cooking again according to what he felt, but no matter how many times he made it, he still couldn't get the taste out. The two also discussed a lot with each other, not understanding why. Kaleem's friend also said that the type of meat used in the preparation was important. If he couldn't find the right kind, he couldn't make the right taste of that restaurant. So his friend had to give up and say goodbye to Kaleem. Feeling frustrated in his body, Kaleem also went out for a walk thinking about those ribs as he walked. Kaleem still couldn't understand that his friend, an experienced chef, couldn't guess what kind of meat it was. So lost in thought, Kaleem wandered around the alleys from afternoon until late at night without realizing it. The surrounding streets and houses also began to lit up. Reshaping, Kaleem found himself coming to a small alley with no street lights and deserted. Struggling to turn back, Kaleem suddenly tripped on something on the ground, causing him to fall forward. The fall made Kaleem's whole body dirty. His face also hit the ground, causing him pain. Kaleem rubbed his face with his hand, then glanced behind him to see what he had tripped on. As soon as Kaleem looked back, he saw a man sitting on the ground with torn clothes. It seemed Kaleem tripped on that person's foot and fell like that. Closer, Kaleem saw that it was the man about Kaleem's age. He appeared to be homeless. Kaleem felt that being unemployed like him was a bad thing, but there were still people in worse situations than him. Kaleem felt very pitiful, so he went to ask the friend. The man did not respond to a word of Kaleem, but immediately closed his eyes and fell asleep when Kaleem approached to talk. Kaleem felt a little strange and sad because his greeting was not answered, but thinking for a moment, he did not mind anymore. Kaleem thought that maybe he was tired. It was so cold, and his clothes were all torn. Therefore, Kaleem took off his coat and put it on him, hoping to help the man. After that, Kaleem quickly returned because it was getting darker and colder. He did not know where he was, and the road was strange. Walking for a while, suddenly Kaleem saw ahead of him an empty field, overgrown with grass, and the scary thing was that all around were tombstones. Amid those tombstones, Kaleem glimpsed two figures digging for something stealthily. Seeing this, Kaleem also quickly retreated. He intended to run away because if two people were doing stealthy things, it might be a bad thing. If he was discovered, Kaleem could be in trouble, but inadvertently Kaleem stepped on a dry branch. That immediately attracted the attention of those two figures. Under the dim moonlight, the figures of those two people also appeared. They were the owner of the other restaurant and his wife. But Kaleem did not have time to see their faces clearly, and when he heard them ask, he panicked and ran away. Seeing no one chasing, Kaleem was somewhat relieved but still closed his eyes and ran, just wanting to get out of this dark alley as quickly as possible. Running away from there, Kaleem was calmer and more secure. He slowed down to rest. Kaleem must have started to feel hungry due to putting all his strength into running, so unknowingly Kaleem went to the other restaurant without knowing that danger awaited him there. Entering the restaurant, Kaleem still ordered his familiar ribs. The owner's wife still came out to greet him as usual. Kaleem was completely oblivious, so he was still greeting her. But unlike every other day, her smile became evil. She even said weird things like this would be Kaleem's last meal. When she left, then Kaleem also began to feel strange, but he was originally unable to see the faces of the other two shadows, so he didn't know anything and continued to eat because he was too hungry. As soon as Kaleem took his chopsticks to eat, the owner's wife also began to approach and stand behind him. While Kaleem didn't notice, she took a stick and hit Kaleem hard on the back of the head, making him unable to react. Kaleem immediately fainted on the dining table. The customers sitting around also did not react to the action of the owner's wife. Kaleem didn't know how long he passed out, but when Kaleem woke up, he found himself tied to a log. Looking around, Kaleem was more surprised because this was the empty land he had just seen at night. Before he could figure out what was happening, Kaleem saw the restaurant's owner standing in front of him. The owner's wife said she was supposed to make Kaleem fatter, but Kaleem saw their secret, so he couldn't let go. The sweet and sour ribs were also in need of new ingredients. The owner's wife said as she licked her lips, very hungry. The husband seemed to be in a hurry. He urged his wife to act quickly so that they could have meat to sell for tonight. Kaleem thought he would have to die here. Tears welled up in his eyes. He begged them, but the two of them didn't care at all. Suddenly they stopped. Their bodies were also trembling and looked behind Kaleem. They looked scared. Kaleem also turned his back to see what made them like this. But that also made Kaleem extremely scared because there were a lot of undead with horrible looks coming towards them. These corpses seemed to be the victims of the owner and the wife of the restaurant. They were coming to take revenge on the owner couple. The wife couldn't stand but fell to the ground, and the husband was so scared that he urinated in his pants. Among the corpses, Kaleem saw a man wearing his dark coat. These corpses had no intention of harming Kaleem, but only rushed to the restaurant owner and his wife. Without thinking much, Kaleem took the opportunity to untie the ropes to escape. When he looked back, Kaleem saw that the other couple was surrounded by these corpses. Once again, Kaleem escaped from there fast, until he was too tired to run. Then he stopped and thought. Remembering the words of the owner's wife, it turned out that the type of meat used to make ribs was human meat. That made Kaleem disgusted and vomit. Kaleem quickly informed the police. They also went with him to the cemetery to check it out. But strangely, there was no trace there. Kaleem went to the restaurant, but when he arrived, the restaurant was gone. It was a dilapidated house and seemed to have been uninhabited for a long time. It was so strange that Kaleem himself could not explain it. So in the end, was the other couple human or ghost? After that, Kaleem did not dare to go to strange places at night anymore. He also opened a small restaurant, but did not dare to include sweet and sour ribs on his menu. This was a strange story of an office worker named Sam. He was the sales manager for a small office in the city center. Recently, Sam was preparing a business plan to present to his superiors. For him, this was an important step in his career, helping him to advance. As of today, it had been a week since he worked overtime. There didn't seem to be a day when he didn't come home late. When the whole office had left, Sam remained alone to continue working. He tiredly looked at the words running in front of the computer desk and then lazily, helplessly leaned back in his chair, looked up at the light bulb on the ceiling with his lethargic dark eyes from lack of sleep. Sam stretched and turned to look at the clock on the wall. It was almost midnight. The work seemed to be almost finished. Sam saw that, so he got up and quickly put on his coat. He put aside work for a while and went out of the office. He walked alone under the streetlights flickering on the street. As he walked, he thought about his life. After a while, suddenly his stomach rumbled. He suddenly remembered all day, because he was so focused, he still hadn't eaten anything. He turned into an alley. At the end of the street was a 24-hour convenience store. How unlucky. Today his familiar shop was closed again. The whole street was pitch black. There was only one crepe cart at the end of the street. Sam was attracted to this crepe cart. He was surprised to see the old cart placed in the dark corner. This was the first time he saw the crepe cart placed here. He breathed a sigh of relief. At least there was still a food cart for sale. He comfortably walked in front of the crepe cart, calling the seller. He waited for a while, and an old woman with a hunchback came out from the crepe cart, telling him that there was only one left. He nodded in agreement. After that, the old woman used her slow movements to make cakes for him. Looking at the old woman, he also knew that he couldn't ask for more. While making cakes, the old woman asked about his life. Sam also happily answered her. He told her about his job and the reason for coming home from work later today. He stood looking at the skillful operation of the old woman making cakes in front of his eyes, with a little interest and attraction in his heart. She poured the cake batter into the pan, coated it with a smooth layer. Her movements were very skillful, looked very pleasing to the eye. The aroma of the cake wafted up, swished across Sam's nose. He smelled the aroma in his heart, anticipating how delicious this cake was. His hand was on his stomach as if to stop the hunger that was screaming inside. While waiting, he also curiously asked the old woman why her children and grandchildren would let her stand selling this late at night alone. She smiled sadly and told him that she had no children. After that, she gave him a still, hot, fragrant crepe with a gentle and kind attitude. He politely took the cake from her hand, smiled, and happily paid. She received a large amount of money from Sam's hand, a little confused in her heart, seeing that Sam also smiled kindly at her, and gave her the change and then left. Sam could not contain his hunger, so he took a big bite of the cake, feeling the relief and relaxation in his heart. Then he turned back towards the crepe cart as if to send the old woman a compliment about the taste of the cake. But when he turned around, he was completely amazed. In front of him was a dark space. The old woman and the crepe cart also suddenly disappeared for unknown reasons, as if no one had ever sold cakes here. Sam saw this, very surprised. He ran into the alley to see where the old woman could go so quickly, but when he got there he couldn't believe his eyes. In front of him appeared a dead-end alley with no way out. At the end of the alley were litter and garbage bags. There was no sign where the old lady had gone. He found it difficult to understand how could the old woman go so fast. So he took the crepe cake in his hand, seeing it still didn't disappear, so he sure didn't see a ghost. He took a big bite. It was surprisingly delicious, not like a cake made by the devil. Sam devoured the cake in his hand and thought about the strange thing he just encountered. Then Sam also left to go home because it was already late at night. He still couldn't stop thinking about what just happened. The next day he woke up in his room. Yesterday's story about the old woman didn't matter to him anymore. He changed his clothes and hurried on his way. As he walked, he found himself daydreaming strangely about the craving he had for the taste of yesterday's cake. So he turned into a familiar alley to go to the old woman who sold him cakes last night. But for some reason this morning he did not see the old lady. Instead, the old woman's cake selling place had an old man sitting there selling corn. He looked old. Sam walked over to ask the old man a few questions. He pointed to the place where the old woman's crepe cart was, asking the old man about the whereabouts of that old woman selling crepes.
The old man was surprised to ask who Sam was. Why did he go looking for the old woman? So Sam told the old man how he had met her last night. After hearing this, the old man became more and more alarmed, coldly said to Sam in a firm voice, "She passed away a long time ago." Sam couldn't believe what he heard anymore, looking at the old man in amazement. Seeing that the old man also invited Sam to sit down and tell him the story about the old woman. No one here knew that old woman. She had sold crepes here when he was young. At that time, the old woman sold cakes at the head of the street. The taste of her cakes were very delicious. It seemed that there was not a day that was not crowded in front of the crepe stall. The workers, no matter how far away, once they had eaten her cake, they had to come back again. Everyone who finished eating her cake could hear her talk and care, so the atmosphere around her cake was always full of laughter and joy. She sold from early morning until late at night. Her house was located quite far from here. After selling, she often rode home alone. No one knew where her children were. People only knew that she lived alone. She lived with a bunch of kids who didn't know if they were her grandchildren or the street kids she adopted. Every time she came home, she would bring home crepes for them. For a bunch of kids, it was the most precious gift in the world. The children received crepes from the old woman and happily shared them with each other. For her, watching them eat and drink was the greatest happiness. But that day was different from the other day. Looking at the children happily eating and playing with each other, she suddenly felt a little sad and insecure in her heart. She quietly told these children all that was necessary and said everything she wanted to say, and to say goodbye. The children heard her say that and immediately bursted into tears. They ran to hug her as if to keep her with them, not letting her leave. The scene that day made many people who witnessed it also moved to the point of pain. The next morning, whatever came would happen. Her regular customers came to her crepe cart as usual to buy cakes. The cart that day was still in the old place, but they called and she didn't answer. Everyone was curious. They went over to take a look and saw that the old woman was sitting on the ground motionless, stiff, not responding to customers like before. They frantically asked each other about the old woman's situation, worried about how she was. One of the people in the crowd looked at her and quickly called a few others to help. Everyone saw that the situation seemed serious, so they ran from the outside to check it out. Everyone looked at her in panic. The old woman was sitting curled up on the ground as usual, but this time her face was pale and stiff, and she was no longer breathing. As he spoke, the old man sadly recalled the past. He regretted when her crepe cart was no more. After listening, Sam also knew what happened last night. As he expected, he met a ghost, but only because she wanted to sell cakes. After knowing the end of the story, Sam said goodbye to the old man and continued on his way to the office, temporarily putting aside the story about the old crepe-selling lady.
Today, Mr. San went to pick up his nephew from the countryside. He just got a job at a horror comic company. Knowing that, San immediately wanted to tell him a ghost story that happened 10 years ago with his two colleagues. Masa and Kosho were a young couple. Currently, they were both teachers at a high school. That day, they finished work later than usual because they had to attend an important school meeting. It was already dark when they left the office. Most of the people decided to stay in the school dormitory. Masa also asked her husband to stay. However, Kosho immediately disagreed. He said that they must go home to take care of their old mother. Masa really did not want to go home at night, but she had to follow her husband to the parking lot. There was a reason why Masa felt so wary about driving at night. Their home was not far away, but they also had to pass through a massive grave. This was the burial place for homeless people, so that was a terrifying thought. And there were also many mysterious rumors about this place. Riding through the streets in the suburbs, a cold feeling immediately came over them. Masa sat on the back of the bicycle, and the cold wind made her restless. Her heart started to beat faster and faster. The closer they got to the tombs, the more scared she felt. She thought about the rumors about the white shadows with bleeding eyes. Thinking about it, Masa suddenly shivered. She hugged Kosho unconsciously, and this gave him a fright. Kosho did not pay much attention to evil things. He thought she was just being silly, so he teased her. Kosho's teasing still didn't help. In order to ease her fear, she then closed her eyes and prayed. But when she closed her eyes, the feeling of fear grew even stronger. Masa felt like someone was watching her. Unable to take it anymore, Masa quickly opened her eyes. Then she saw a white shadow flickering behind the bushes. Masa panicked. She closed her eyes again and then opened them again. But still, she saw this white figure standing there. Then the figure started running after them. But Masa stayed quiet, with no reaction. Still, staring in disbelief, the bike suddenly leaned to the side and crashed. They had hit something. Luckily, Masa quickly put both hands on the ground, so there was no serious injury. Then, Masa turned to look at her husband, but just from the shadow on his back, she could tell something was not right. Kosho lay motionless on the ground, as if nothing had happened. His face was dark. Worried for her husband, Masa stood up with both hands and went closer to observe, even more panicked. She had never seen Kosho look so silly. He was even drooling down the corner of his mouth. Her heart suddenly started to beat faster. She remembered the white shadow that she saw earlier. Maybe Kosho was possessed. Although her heart was filled with fear, she could not leave her husband behind. Then, Masa helped Kosho stand up and took him home. Masa didn't know why she felt so insecure when Kosho cycled in front, so she asked her husband to sit behind her. Unlike his usual personality, when Kosho heard that, he happily agreed and even urged his wife to quickly return home. More than anyone, Kosho knew that Masa was not good at cycling. But today, he agreed to let her drive. It was weird. As soon as they got home, Masa saw her mother-in-law waiting at the door. It seemed she had a feeling that something was not right. Seeing her mother-in-law and feeling overwhelmed the entire way, Masa cried loudly and told her what happened. After telling her she saw the white shadow and all about her husband's strange behavior, the mother's face immediately changed to a shade of pure white. As if she had just understood something, she did not say anything. She quietly just went inside to the altar to burn some incense. After she finished burning the incense, she approached her son. Her face and voice also changed. She was shouting at a stranger to get out of his body. Kosho immediately folded his arms, admitting he was a lost spirit. So he entered Kosho's body to find something to eat. It seemed as if the mother had encountered something like this before. After talking to him, she immediately turned her head to tell her daughter-in-law to go prepare some food. Masa didn't understand what she was going on about, but quickly went to the kitchen to cook up a bowl of noodles. Just a few minutes later, the bowl of noodles was empty. It seemed that the soul had been starving for a long time. After eating one bowl, he asked for one more, promising after eating he would immediately leave. Seeing this, the old woman did not deny him another bowl of noodles and immediately sent her daughter-in-law to cook more. Just a few minutes later, the second bowl of noodles was brought out. The spirit quickly accepted it with a hungry face. Just like that, 1, 2, 3, and 6 bowls of noodles were put away, but still couldn't fill his hungry stomach. Unable to take it any longer, the old woman shouted loudly. After she finished speaking, the spirit immediately sobbed, saying that he also wanted to go, but he could not. Seeing this, Massa approached and pleaded softly. The spirit did not want to hide anything and told the truth about his case. It turned out that the white shadow that Massa saw was another spirit, and because he was threatened by it, he tried to enter a human. In order to save her son, the old woman had to say that she would help him, but with the request that after being done, he must immediately set her son free. As the woman spoke those words, he had no reason to refuse. He immediately nodded and accepted the mother's request. Then, he said nothing. He silently turned his gaze towards the main gate, as if to signal something. Seeing the actions of the soul, the mother immediately understood. She hurried to tell the daughter-in-law to watch the house and went out. A moment later, she saw her coming back inside with an old man. This man, Zen, had an extraordinary ability to defeat demons. After listening to everything, he looked very serious, holding out an incense burner in the middle of the yard. Then he burned a large bunch of incense and clasped his hands together. Once done with that, he turned back and told the mother and daughter to follow behind him and not say anything. Although they didn't know what he was planning to do, they were worried about Kosho. They then kept quiet and followed. After a while, Massa suddenly stopped and stared at the wall next to the entrance. She shouted, calling for her mother-in-law and Mr. Zen to come. It turned out that there was a human face on the wall looking at them. After observing carefully, Mr. Zen immediately told them to stand aside. Then, he lifted the laser and pointed it straight towards the face of the demon. Mr. Zen lowered his voice. He began to mutter a strange spell. Unexpectedly, that face gradually faded and disappeared into the nothingness. Finally, it seemed like everything settled down, but the mother was still concerned that the hungry ghost might be tricking them. She asked Mr. Zen to talk to him. Mr. Zen went straight towards Kosho's body, telling him that he had banished that soul forever, and that now he was able to go. Not only that, he also added that if he had any further requests, he will happily respond. The soul immediately sighed and replied, "He's always starving. He had no worshipper. He just wanted to be full." Hearing that, the mother interjected, promising to prepare delicious food and wine every day. The kindness of the old mother and that of Mr. Zen left no reason for the soul to stay anymore. After thanking them, he disappeared. Kosho violently convulsed, then passed out. Kosho had been unconscious for 2 days. When he woke up, he couldn't remember what had happened to him. He only felt severe pain through his head. His stomach was very uncomfortable, as if he had just eaten 3 days' worth of food.
This story is about a newly married couple. To Aki, Jen was the most wonderful woman he had ever met. And to Jen, Aki was her last hope for a true love. Jen used to deal with depression for a long time. She had a traumatic childhood as her father constantly beat her. The man had destroyed her emotions ever since. Gradually she no longer had faith in love, but since the moment she met Aki, everything had changed. Indeed, Jen had placed her faith in the right person. The first days of their marriage, Aki was so in love with her as he took great care of his wife and comforted her a lot. There were days when Jen was sickened. There were days where Jen was sick. He even took days off his work to look after her. Despite having to go to work all week long, every Sunday Aki always spent his time taking his wife to the park for some fresh air as it would be healthy for her. But the thoughts of having to earn enough money to pay for the two's basic needs had put a lot of pressure on him. Aki had to pay every expense in the house, from the electricity bills to the rent. With the salary of a normal employee like him, he found it truly difficult to deal with. Aki decided to set out to work for a big company in the city in the hopes of getting a career development. As the new job demanded more of his time, the man rarely had a chance to see his wife at home. The first days being away from Jen had been so difficult to Aki as he missed her terribly. But he tried to deal with it and kept working for a better life for the two. All the stress and pressure he had at work were all kept to himself, as he didn't want his wife to worry about him. But gradually months of negatively pent-up emotion had caused changes in his behavior. Every time his wife called him, he merely responded that he was extremely busy, so he couldn't go back home and see her. The intensive, grueling work, together with his wife constantly demanding to see him, made him wary. Knowing her husband had to work far away from home more than anyone, she was longing for her husband to come home since it had been over 3 months going by, yet she still hadn't had a chance to see him. Jen assumed her husband had found himself another woman and left her. Aki was annoyed every time Jen tried to ask him about his loyalty to her. He didn't want to see her acting jealous like that. Indeed, Aki had been heavily focusing on his work. He worked tirelessly, days and nights, just to make sure his family lived a full and happy life. That night, as usual, Jen called him on the phone. But there was something strange in her voice, as she normally replied to her husband in a cheerful manner. But this time, she was dangerously quiet. Aki had also sensed something odd was happening. The next morning, as Aki was doing his job, one of his colleagues told him that there was a call from a woman who introduced herself as Aki's wife. But somehow she hung up quickly without leaving any message. Aki felt insecure, yet he still remained calm. He went to the balcony for some fresh air, trying to connect the dots. Actually, he really wanted to return home to his wife, but the fear of being berated for leaving his work had prevented him from doing it. Right that moment, from behind, the director patted him on the shoulder and said, "You could take a few days off to return home and check on your wife if you want to." It turned out that the director had been told about Aki's situation, so perhaps it was the reason why he wanted to give Aki some days off to return home to his wife. But it wasn't exactly like that. The director told Aki that his wife had called him and asked to see her husband for the last time. Aki immediately felt worried as soon as he found out about it. Why did she act like that? Was there anything bad happening to her? As the director left, he quickly made a phone call to Jen to check on her. Someone picked up the phone, but there was just a dead silence at the other end of the line. Unable to wait any longer, Aki spoke something, yet there was no reply from Jen. The utter silence irritated Aki, as he thought his wife was being mad at him, so she didn't say anything. Feeling angry, he scolded Jen badly and said hurtful things to her, but there was still no reply from her. Aki was sure someone was definitely holding the phone since he had heard some minor noises, but the reason why Jen didn't answer was unbeknownst to him. A while later, as Aki had calmed down, he told his wife that he was going to take a few days off and return home. The man announced it to her without knowing whether she could hear him or not. As Aki was about to hang up, Jen suddenly spoke to him in a cold, strange voice that startled him. In a muttering voice she said she was always waiting for him and would prepare a special dish for him as soon as he got home. A statement that supposedly to be normal, yet it stuck in his mind for a while. On the way home he couldn't stop thinking about it. After 2 hours being on the road, he finally made it home. With a cheerful expression on his face, he opened the door and got inside. But his wife didn't show up to welcome him home with a warm hug. Anyway, Aki wasn't bothered much thinking about it. He searched for his wife everywhere in the house, and then saw her in the kitchen with a bowl of hot soup. But she didn't say anything as she was looking down. Aki thought that maybe his wife was still mad at him, so he didn't scold her at all, just gladly sat at the table and enjoyed the soup. But there was another thing that made him felt strange. The soup had the pleasantly appetizing aroma. Seeing the expression on Aki's face, one could easily tell how delicious the dish was. But contrary to its wonderfully pungent aroma, the soup was extremely hard to eat. It even had an unpleasant fishy smell. Aki immediately sensed something odd with the soup. After a moment of thinking, he asked Jen what the soup was made of, but Jen didn't say anything. Having no other choice, Aki had to bring the bowl inside. And by the way, checked what was inside the pot that made his soup tasted horrible. As Aki removed the lid, his face suddenly became darkened. He was completely terrified to see the scene before his eyes. How unbelievable it was. Inside the pot was a human hand. But whose hand was this? And how could Jen do such a horrifying thing? Aki was panicking, but he still tried to remain calm to take in the situation. Next he smelled a stench coming from a corner of the kitchen. Looking over, Aki saw a body of a woman laying on the floor. As he approached the body, he realized it was his beloved wife. Seeing her laying on the ground and moving, he felt an immense pain in his heart. He constantly held her name, but it was too late. There was a jar of sleeping pills beside her. It looked like she had taken them to commit suicide. But even more horrifying was one of her arms was gone. At this point, Aki realized it was all his faults that caused the death of his wife. During his time being away from home, Jen had fallen into depression again, and there was a strong likelihood that she had cut off one of her arms and cooked it for her husband. But who was sitting at the table? Jen's body was here, but the girl sitting there was still neither moving nor saying anything, while a heavy atmosphere quickly was taking over the room. The death of his wife, together with the appearance of this mysterious woman, made Aki panic. His face got darkened, sweat was dripping as he fearfully crawled backwards. He took out his phone, intended to call an ambulance, but as no one had picked up the phone, Aki suddenly felt dizzy and fainted on the ground. As he woke up, he found himself in a hospital and was surrounded by many of his colleagues. They all looked worried for him. When Aki completely regained his consciousness, one of his co-workers broke the news to him, saying Jen had died and the soup was actually made from one of her arms. Aki couldn't hold in his emotions anymore. He didn't expect that his carelessness would cause his beloved wife to suffer from depression again and die such a tragic death. The co-worker pitied the young couple having to deal with such a tragic incident. He confronted Aki and encouraged them to keep on living. He even revealed to Aki that after researching their house, they had found a letter from Jen to Aki. It turned out that Jen was under the impression that her husband had found another woman and no longer loved her. In the suicide note, Jen said that she would still love him deeply, no matter how he treated her. Perhaps it was the main reason that made Jen cut off one of her arms after taking the pills and cooked it as a last meal for Aki. After the death of his wife, Aki had become a madman. The guilt within him had turned him into a psycho, days and nights wandering, begging on the streets.
Our family was eating lunch together, then suddenly heard someone knocking on the door loudly. My mom couldn't hide the amazement on her face. She told my dad to go out and look who it was. My dad opened the door and looked around. It was Mr. Kun, one of our neighbors. He looked anxious as sweat was dripping down his face. Mr. Kun asked my dad to help him take his son to the hospital urgently as he was in critical condition. My dad quickly reached to his jacket and then went with him. As Mr. Kun slowly regained his composure, he told my dad that his son Kalim was suffering from a strange disease that made him unable to move. Out of curiosity, I decided to follow them. My dad switched on the engine of his truck. He usually used it to carry farm produce in my village. Even though my dad told me to stay home, I insisted on going with him. My dad held at me. "Stay home! This is none of your business." But I tried to convince him to let me go with him, even promised not to cause him any inconvenience on the way. As they were in a hurry, my dad agreed to take me with him. The loud noise came from the truck engines created an atmosphere of tension which made us feel really distressed. As we arrived at Mr. Kun's house, we saw our neighbors gathering in front of the gate, talking loudly. My dad and Mr. Kun quickly went inside. At that moment, I was really curious to know about Kalim's situation. From my spot, I could see Kalim's mom in the house, assisting her son up as he was on the ground. His belly was bloated. It was so big that it made him look like a frog. He was screaming in pain. I could see his face turn pale as the pain had worn him out. His limbs were numb as he couldn't move at all. My dad and Mr. Kun lifted him up to the truck, but he was extremely heavy, like a big stone. As Kalim finally got into the truck, we made our way to the hospital instantly. We carried him to the emergency room. Things got worse for Kalim as he was required to undergo surgery in order to remove something out of his stomach. My dad asked Mr. Kalim how his son ended up being like that. Mr. Kun sighed when he heard the question from my father. He had no idea what had happened to his son, as the young man was seen lying on the ground, hands covering his belly this morning. My dad quickly reassured him, saying perhaps it was just food poisoning. The surgery was finished an hour later. Luckily, Kalim was no longer in danger. As Kalim had regained his composure, we decided to go check on him. Mr. Kun asked Kalim what had happened. The doctor said they had found mud and rocks in Kalim's stomach, which caused his belly to bloat like that. Kalim couldn't believe what he just heard. He breathed a weary sigh, then told us what had happened. Last night, Kalim, together with his partners, were on his last shipment of the day to the market. Everyone was exhausted at the end of the day. Kalim invited his co-workers to have a meal with him before they returned home, but they thought it was a bad idea to eat out this late at night, so they turned down his offer and told him to get home soon. They said goodbye to each other and left. As Kalim was riding his bicycle on the familiar path, he began to whistle in order to disrupt the quietness surrounding him. All of a sudden, he felt like there was an extra weight, as if there was someone sitting on the bike seat. As the man turned around, he saw a young woman sitting behind him. The woman greeted Kalim, asking why he returned home so late. It wasn't much of a surprise for Kalim to see this woman, as the two had met before. The woman always asked him for a ride every time she saw him going past the street. But he was wondering how he didn't have any idea about her getting on his bike. What was even stranger to him was when Kalim started a conversation with the woman, she stayed silent and ignored him. The woman told Kalim to stop the bike. It was at this moment something terrifying happened to him. As Kalim turned around, he no longer saw the woman being with him. He confusedly looked around, searching for her. But what came into sight was just a vast, empty space, with no houses to be seen. Was the woman's house deep in the forest? Kalim was really curious about her. Kalim continued to pedal his bike. Suddenly, he saw three strangers coming out of a clump of bushes as they walked towards him. Kalim was amazed. He wondered to himself why these three men were blocking his way. One of the guys talked to him.
Hey.
The man said he and his friends had just finished their shift at work and were on their way home. The group intended to paint the town red tonight as they'd received their payday. Kalim's eyes dilated as he listened to the guy. Being absolutely under with work for days made him crave the smell of liquor. Knowing Kalim wanting to join the group, they asked him to go with them. Their amiability made it impossible for Kalim to turn down the offer. They took him to an abandoned housing block which looked pretty hushed and scary. Kalim felt worried. He came up with the reason of living far away from here yet had to return home early, then said goodbye to them. But one man in the group refused to let him leave. He told Kalim to stay as it was dangerous to go outside this late. Moreover, Kalim could stay the night in his house and had a drink with him. The man even told Kalim they were working at the same company. Then he guided Kalim to a large, spacious house. As soon as he walked in, the smell of food instantly caught his attention as his stomach growled. They told him to sit at the table while bringing out liquor. At first, Kalim was quite shy to be there. He timidly scratched his head. As the host poured out the wine, he told Kalim to make himself at home and enjoyed his stay there. The man raised a toast to Kalim. His hospitality made him feel really comfortable. Kalim was no longer being timid as he drank up his glass of wine. The men altogether raised their glasses to celebrate their friendship. They drank and chatted happily afterwards. As it was nearly morning, Kalim had eaten up all the food on the table. He couldn't stop complimenting how delicious the food was while enjoying the dishes. As Kalim gulped his last glass of wine, he fainted on the table. His face turned red and his body was reeking of alcohol. When he woke up, the sun had already set. As the man opened his eyes, he felt aching throughout his whole body as he trembled and felt an immense pain in his stomach. When Kalim looked down, he panicked to find out that his abdomen was swollen while the pain became more and more unbearable to him. It's not to say that at the moment his body was covered with mud. There was more stuff in his mouth and sand remained in his mustache. He found himself lying inside a deep hole, in the middle of nowhere while the tree people he met last night had disappeared. Kalim wondered if it was him being too wasted that they dragged him out of the house. He stood up, tried to climb out of the hole, but the man was terrified by the horrifying scene in front of him. There were graves appearing before his eyes. The majority of them had been desecrated. Kalim stood in bewilderment, witnessing the horrific scene. He was filled with sheer terror as he told us about the incident. After being discharged from the hospital, Kalim returned to the place with his dad. Turned out that it was a mass grave of a family which was involved in a traffic accident. Around the area, people usually saw a female ghost asking them for a ride, and the mysterious men trying to lure someone to their whereabouts.
Shen and I have been close friends since we were children, and one day while we were playing, I senselessly asked about Shen's family. Because the Shen family was the wealthiest in the area as a result of selling tofu for many generations. Shen stated that his great-grandfather Jin started his career without any resources, and there was a thrilling story that had been passed down in the Shen family until now. Shen then began telling me the story. He also told me not to tell anyone about the story, which piqued my interest even more. Shen's great-grandfather Jin worked as a hired worker for other people when he was young. His life was very difficult and poor. Jin's daily job was simply mowing the lawn or doing other jobs that people hired him for. Jin married after a while as well. Soon after, they had a child, and that was now Shen's grandfather. Because life was too difficult, Jin devised a business plan to help his family. He saved up and purchased a bag of fresh soybeans. His business plan based on a tofu recipe taught by Jin's mother in the past. He ground these beans to get water. Back in the day, people cooked milk with soybeans mainly. With Jin's heirloom recipe, the bean paste quickly solidified into a large, soft mass that looked very delicious. Jin initially offered to sell to local households, but because they were unfamiliar with the food, they only bought a little at a time. When they returned home, they could make many different delicious and nutritious dishes with the tofu, and Jin's tofu gradually gained popularity. People in the area began to come to Jin for more purchases. Jin suggested to his wife that they open a small shop for business as their business grew better and better. Because their business was doing well, people from other areas frequently came to place orders, and Jin would deliver the tofu to them. Jin was completing an order as usual one day. He needed to transport the tofu to the next village, so Jin woke up early to prepare to go. Because there were no other modes of transportation available at the time, everything was transported by road. But when he arrived, the customer's house was closed and there appeared to be no one living in there, so Jin returned. The couple felt strange, but what concerned them more was that the tofu couldn't be stored for long. Especially this was almost all of their tofu for today. But instead of giving up, Jin decided to carry the tofu around and sell it, as well as visit other villages to see if anyone would buy it. So Jin carried the tofu to go once more. It was getting dark now. Jin had gone for a long time but only sold a few of the tofu, and seeing that it was already dark, he was disappointed and was about to return. Jin then noticed from a distance a very large and extremely busy restaurant with many customers coming in and out. Jin was taken aback by how deserted the area was, but this restaurant was doing exceptionally well. Jin turned to leave when he heard a voice calling him from behind. Jin quickly turned around when he noticed the restaurant owner beckoning from a distance. Jin walked over to see what he needed. The owner then offered to buy all of Jin's tofu. Jin was taken aback. Why would a stranger offer to buy himself a whole basket of tofu?
Hello, I'm a friend of your mother, and I heard your tofu is delicious. Just leave it all to me, said the owner.
Accompanied by an invitation to join them for dinner because his restaurant was hosting a party to commemorate a special occasion today, but Jin refused, stating that all he needed to do was carry the tofu inside and return. The owner did not force him at this time. He simply told Jin to carry the tofu to the kitchen and then he could leave. Jin followed the owner inside the large house and went straight to the kitchen. The owner put his hand on Jin's shoulder just as he was about to turn around, intending to keep Jin. He explained that he wanted to invite Jin to dinner to show his admiration. Also, the way back was a bit long and it was already dark, and he saw Jin was very tired. Jin still refused, citing the fact that his family was waiting for him at home. However, the owner was still ecstatic and pushed Jin to the table. Jin was pushed to a dining table with the owner's enthusiasm, and what was in front of him surprised Jin. Because there was such a feast in front of Jin right now, full of fish and meat, which were cooked very attractively, Jin couldn't resist the enticing scent of the food after carrying tofu for the whole afternoon and being exhausted as well. Seeing the increasing number of customers entering the restaurant, Jin initially planned to eat briefly and then leave. Jin devoured a chicken thigh because such a hearty meal was normally difficult to have. Jin looked around for a while of attentive eating and noted something was wrong. Jin looked at the people next to him. They didn't talk at all, and they didn't even eat. He took the initiative to start a conversation, but they did not respond. Jin reasoned that they didn't like him because he didn't pay for the meal. Looking back, the restaurant's owner was seated with other customers. Jin was a little embarrassed because he had been invited to eat such delicious food like this for free. As a result, Jin decided to bring a cup of tea to the next table to toast with the owner to thank for treating him so well. Jin attempted to speak and thank him when he arrived, but the owner did not respond. He was sitting still, neither eating nor responding to Jin. Jin noticed something odd and asked if the owner thought he was a jerk because he ate without paying. But no matter how many times he asked, the owner sat motionless. Jin took the initiative to call him because he thought it was too weird, but as soon as he walked over to touch the owner, Jin was startled by what he saw. All of the dishes on the table in front of the owner and his guests. There was no meat or fish at all, only worms and maggots on the plates. And they were still alive, crawling around on the plates and on the table. Other foods were simply soil and worms. Jin panicked at this point and the owner slowly turned around. Jin screamed in terror when a skull full of maggots appeared. Jin was so terrified and panicked, he took a step back and attempted to flee, but tripped. Jin fainted after his head hit the ground, and he had no idea what had happened. Not sure how long Jin was unconscious, but when he awoke, he saw a large crowd in front of him. He opened his eyes slowly to see better. It turned out to be his wife and some close neighbors. Jin was still in shock and was about to tell his wife what he had witnessed. The old man who lived next door quickly stopped him, preventing Jin from speaking. After that, everyone pitched in to help Jin get out of the woods. After that, everyone told Jin that because it was late at night and he hadn't returned, his wife had called some neighbors to look for him. After a while searching around, everyone found Jin lying next to a grave. With his mouth full of mud, Jin heard it and was perplexed. Had he met ghosts? Jin quickly put his hand in his pocket after recalling that they had paid him. Jin took out a bunch of dried leaves. Jin dashed over to check the tofu load because he remembered selling the tofu to those ghosts, and they used the tofu in a variety of delicious dishes. And when he opened it, there was no longer any tofu inside. So what happened to the tofu in the end? Jin's family was very concerned about him after what happened, but Jin insisted that he was fine. Jin simply stated that he was tired and needed to rest. Jin vomited a lot after that because of what he ate, and everything Jin vomited up was mud mixed with tofu. Jin eventually stopped delivering and began to open a restaurant, serving dishes with tofu as the main course. The strange thing was that after that day, Jin's tofu suddenly became more popular and customers were lining up every day. Surprisingly, the idea of opening a tofu restaurant made Jin's business much more convenient. Jin's tofu had almost gotten everyone addicted and crazy. Jin believed he got this idea from his ghost encounter. Soon after, Jin's restaurant appeared like a kite in the wind, and it was soon able to expand into a large store, and Jin became increasingly wealthy. After hearing Shen's story, I began to have strange thoughts. That the tofu pieces my parents bought from the Shen family, which I ate every day, had anything to do with the bugs or the things Jin went through that night.